But most of you know me as Salina, one of the Eritrean sisters. We sing. We've been singing together for over 10 years, mostly to a lot of you in the audience. You've watched us grow up. But today I want to speak to you as a young Eritrean woman who has been trying to reconcile a powerful history with this burning desire to shape a new future. So I want to share some of the work I've been doing, the work I'm currently doing, and the key pieces that have helped shape my philosophy towards living a purpose-driven life. And I have some photos that I want to share whenever it gets on the screen. Essentially, I want to start with the beginning, which is my ancestry. And it starts with my father. And, you can imagine a photo of him. Munaget Abraha, any who know him? The power is out, okay. Okay. So anyway, my father, like any Eritrean in 1977, grew up in Meda. He joined the ELF when he was 13 years old. He left home, graduated from Mereh at age 17. And before the end of ELF in 1981, he was a musician, a guitarist, and a teacher before he entered Sudan as a refugee. And fast forward today, he's now a Boeing engineer in the US. And I also want to speak about my mother because I think that these stories are important to recognize as well. She doesn't like to be in pictures, so she'll be happy that it's not showing. And she was one of the many Eritreans who were living in Ethiopia during the war, living through the Derg and the Red Terror. And there's a painful history there that I think I've learned to hear about. And I think our parents, if they are able and willing to tell their stories, and when we are patient enough to listen, they're filled with incredibly powerful stories of pain and resilience and purpose. And so just as our parents' stories are in every fiber of their being, they also run through my blood. And so I'm constantly reminded and thinking about this. And even though I talk about my parents, I often think about how it goes way beyond our parents. We have an ancestral legacy of thousands, hundreds and thousands of years of our people, our families, working in community together, facing adversity, whether it was colonialism, Italian, British, Ethiopia. I just don't want us to forget that legacy. And this brings me to maybe showing some of my pictures. My first piece is Ancestry. And if it's possible to show some of this. In the third slide, you can just see my father when he was young, his last picture with his family. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, next. Yeah. So that's him playing the guitar. You can see where our musician kind of spirit came from. Next. Yeah, this is Dad today. And next up, we have, I think, my mom and dad. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, that's Tiblet and Muligeta. Very cute. So can you go to the next two slides? Yeah, possibility. This is the most important thing to me because we are the first generation in a 1,000-year chain to cross the Atlantic Ocean and settle in this country, America, the land of possibility, of opportunity. And when you live in the pinnacle of freedom and possibility, it's very overwhelming. There's so many different ways you can choose to live your life. You have choice. And it's hard to focus clearly on what impact do I want to have, what will be my legacy, how do I want to show up for my community. And these are the key questions that have been on my mind as I seek to find my purpose. Can you go to the next slide? Purpose. And go to the next one. And I think it starts for me with, I knew we went to Eritrea back many times. We got to sing and to connect with our people, so I knew I wanted to do something. And given that the majority of the population relies on rain-fed agriculture, I thought, let's talk about the environment. It's something that is being threatened every day. Land is degrading, and with that, livelihoods and people's ability to survive does as well. So I studied environmental science and economics. That's Leanda and I. We graduated 3 years ago. And while I was studying, I joined a few associations for the environment. If you go to the next slide. And IFSA is a global nonprofit run by students, for students. And this organization helps me realize that being young doesn't mean sitting and waiting and learning. It means taking action now and being proactive. And if you go to the next slide, and the next, there's just photos of me being able to experience different ecosystems, countries, understanding how people live in relation to their environment. And the next. Yeah, so over time I learned, and I worked in the organization for a few years until I felt comfortable enough to run for president. I was very scared. I don't like to speak in front of people. But it went successfully, and in the past year, I traveled the world speaking on behalf of young people across the 53 countries that we are represented in, and the work that they're doing. And we spent a lot of time educating young people, empowering them, and teaching them how to engage in their community in environmental matters. And to the next slide. Yeah, that's a lot of me speaking on a lot of spaces that you don't see, an Eritrean person, let alone, a black woman on a stage. So it was very powerful for me to be able to experience this. This was probably the peak of it all, giving a speech, a keynote address at the United Nations in New York with the Deputy Secretary General. In the next picture, you'll see me with her. And just being so proud of who I am, my culture, my history, my parents, and being Eritrean. Yeah. And I think it's so important that we are not afraid to say that everywhere we go. It doesn't matter what people think. It's an opportunity to change their minds and to get them as excited as we are about our country. And so as I traveled the world and spoke about different things, I began to realize that my pull to my country was so strong, and I wasn't doing enough, and I felt more American sometimes than I was Eritrean. I was like, what am I gonna do? So that takes me back to the next slide, which is purpose. And I decided to combine my experience with something that I thought was an interesting case study in Eritrea. So if you go to the next slide, this talks about the research that I did at the first modern mine in Eritrea with foreign investment, which is Bisham mine. I think some of you have heard about the gold that we've been trying to see and find. And so I decided to go figure out if historically exploitative industry, which is damaging to the environment and doesn't have a great history in Africa, can be consistent with sustainable development in Eritrea, and how is the government going about doing this? What's the community impact, and what's the impact on the environment? So if you go to the next slide, I spent a year and a half diving into this topic, looking at what are the mining policies across the continent, how does this coincide with development, what's the governance framework in Eritrea, and then what is the role of the private sector. In this case, it was a Canadian-owned company that had a 60% stake, and the government owned 40%. So how does that relationship between the private sector from a different country and Eritrea coincide to coherent programs and policies that move forward the development that we want as people? In the next slide, this is, it's a lot, but it helps to get your mind around what are the different ministries and the different policies that govern these spaces. So there's the Ministry of Land and Water and Environment, the Ministry of Energy and Mines, and then ENAMCO, which is within the Ministry of Finance, and that's the Eritrean National Mining Company. And they hold a 30% stake in every mining project that happens in Eritrea, and in this case, they had bought an additional 10% to have 40%. And the next slide. This is a deeper dive into the National Environmental Plan of Eritrea. So before you do any kind of project, any project is approved. There's different categories. So category A, B, C. Category A is one that has clearly a great impact on the environment, something like mining. You're kind of taking up a large piece of the soil, of land and disrupting it. So it goes through this process. You have to do an environmental impact assessment. You have a committee with different representatives from different ministries that decide, is it cleared, is it not cleared, what are the conditions, how do we follow up? So that was important to just see all the different measures that have been taken into place, the really robust policies that we have, the way that they were created with the best available science and universities. So it gave me a lot of hope. I was a bit scared when I came in, and I felt really confident coming in, looking at the framework that Eritrea had established for itself, to know that there was a lot of security there. The next slide. So this is just an overview of the deposit itself. The first layer is the oxide layer, which has the gold that is most precious. The second is copper, and the last is the blue layer, which is the copper and zinc. And when I visited, they had finished the gold, I think, in 2013, and they just started copper and zinc. So if you go to the next slide, I think you'll see, yeah, these are the flotation tanks where they start to mix up all of the rock that they've taken up with chemicals and to pull up the copper that exists and start to process it. And you can maybe see deep in the back before that hill, there's a big pond. And that pond captures all of the kind of dangerous toxic water that comes out of this process. So it can evaporate into the air and is protected so it doesn't go down into the groundwater. Next slide. This is just where Bisha is located in the Gashbarka region. The good thing is it's not a big forested area. It's mostly woodland, not a lot of trees and a few shrubs. So there wasn't necessarily a great loss of forest cover in doing this project. In the next slide. Yep, so going into land rehabilitation, I'm just going to quickly go over this. Next slide. There's two types of ways to go about this. So if you have a mine, it's very crude. You dig up all of the rock and you process it for 13 years. And then at the end of the mine, you put everything back and you plant over it, and that's land rehabilitation. But what they're doing right now is doing offset planting. So how can we restore the land around the mine and improve the biodiversity, the wildlife, accordingly? So in the next slide, I had to go see it for myself, because you can't read everything on paper. So I had a great time going to Bisha and being trained to switch out my shoes and wear my hat and my goggle and just be ready for the mining life. And the next slide, this shows how much land was disturbed and how much was being rehabilitated and how much has offset planting. And it's very hard to do this until the mine is closed, but there was a lot of positive progress happening at the time. You can see in the next slide. This is some of the offset planting that they started to do. And in the next slide, you'll see the nursery, which is where they grow the species. They are all native and indigenous to Eritrea. There's some of the strongest seedlings that come from the area. In the next slide, this are pictures that I took. There's a little bit of erosion on the side because of some specific issues, but they were aware of how to kind of combat that and work on this. And in the next slide, there's just a picture of how they're doing this offset planting as the Bisha employees, and it's a bit difficult because it's not easy to do this in this region. If any of you have been to Gashbarka, it's hot, and it's not great for survival rates, so a lot of these plants will die. So they're reviewing how they can reevaluate this process and improve this a bit more strongly. In the next slide, I think we're going into how does this impact the community? So the main issue I noticed when looking at the histories of these extractive industries in the rest of Africa is that it often comes along with corruption and inequality. So just because you have oil, you have diamonds, you have this, doesn't mean the whole country is going to develop. We've seen that happen over and over again. Why is Africa so rich but then so poor? So there was this fear, I think, that is rational for any individual who's working in this space. that potentially the communities around Bisha would develop while the rest of the country doesn't, that a few people will benefit and the rest of the country wouldn't. So there was a long discussion between Nevsun, the Canadian company, and Eritrean government to find a balance to where any community development program that happens is in line with the national development plans, that they're done with the community, with the Zoba level administration, and the priorities were identified by the Eritrean people and not the Canadian company who said, I feel like building a hospital here today. So that also was just reassuring to see how strong the Eritrean spirit of self-reliance is throughout the entire process. Yeah. It just gave me so much hope because there are so many stories of how it's been done wrong. So to come to my country and see the amount of thought that's happened and the way this ended up being a success was such a joy. So the next slide. This is where Bisha is in relation to the communities around. And the first community projects that they started to do in 2016. The first one was in Aderat, I think. In the next slide. Oh, that's just me. I'm just talking to some people. In the next slide, I think, okay. The first community project they did was about just having water, a pothole in the community. So young girls were walking 3 kilometers every day to fetch water for their families. So what they decided to do was to build a borehole and piping with solar power, and they made sure that the community was helping and invested in it so that they really understood the true value of this project. And in the next slide, I think you'll see we were on our way to deliver the pipes to this project, but then we got stuck in the mud because it was rainy season. So we tried again the next day. That day didn't work. But it was really amazing to see that happen in the end. And the next slide is with Tekraret, I think. And the next, their engine had broken down and they couldn't get water from their community, so they had to walk 6 kilometers to get water every day. So I visited the solar panel installation that was being constructed by the company. And the next slide. Yeah, this is before the panels were set in, but this would help get the pump going again, bring water back to the community. And the last one is in Adi Ibrahim, I think, and this was a water diversion structure that was blocked, and they managed to unblock it and to get water flowing again in order to have farming begin. So there's a lot, to be honest, and if anyone wants to learn more, I have committed to writing a regular blog series about the work and the results. But I think it's an opportunity for us to be reinvigorated, I think, and to know that there's so much we can do and there's so much good that's being done, the foundation is set. And so I think the next slide that I wanted to talk about to close on is just responsibility. The responsibility that I feel, I think that everyone here feels, which is this desire to do something and to not live our lives in absence of connection to our community and our people. And particularly with the environment, I know in the US climate change, maybe is real, maybe isn't. But it is something that if it affects anyone first, it's going to be the global south, it's going to be Africa, it's going to be Eritrea. So much of the country depends on rain-fed agriculture at the moment. And as things change in the next 12 years, we only have 12 years to make a difference. I think this is something we need to feel a greater sense of responsibility towards. I don't care for the environment just for the environment, it's for the people. And so let's just take that into consideration as we do more work. And I'd love to connect with anyone who wants to help me do more in the country. That's it, all I have. Thank you.